ask the audience to engage with them if the audience has any questions. So my first question, basically, for Ms. Ramya, I think when we speak of happiness, we speak of engagement, contentment, being just engaged with the actual processes of the learning process. We know that in the education system we have teachers, we have students, we have also parents, and of course administrative educators who are involved. So how much of parents' involvement do you think is necessary, or you deemed necessary when you went through your experience? So can you comment on that, please?
Thank you very much for the question. I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. Obviously, parents and community members are a very important part of the school community, and we can't talk about what happens in schools and in education without talking about parents. So we had also a few parents who responded to our survey. But I think ultimately when you look at the 22 criteria in our framework, none of these things can really happen kind of in a sustainable sense if we don't have the buy-in of parents. So, for example, when we talk about, as I'd mentioned, reducing the workload and emphasizing less on the tests and the grades, if you're in a system where parents don't support that, then it's very, very hard to imagine how schools could really, make that shift, which is why I was saying that for us, in terms of taking forward this work, it would be quite important to think about advocacy and outreach, because we live in a part of the world where the mindset is still very much kind of traditional, focused on the numbers. I don't think that there's necessarily a right answer in terms of how much parental engagement is needed in schools. I mean, obviously, it depends on the context, and obviously, different parents have different ways that they engage. Some are actively involved in parent-teacher associations, for example, school management committees. Others are working maybe 2 or 3 jobs and don't have, the time to devote to something like that. But I think ultimately all parents are concerned with the education of their children, and have to be very much a part of the conversation in terms of implementing something like our framework.
Thank you very much. So parents' involvement is indispensable in this case then. Okay, thank you very much. I have another question then related to happiness also. In each culture there is a different or unique definition or feeling for happiness. So how is that, how you incorporated that into your experience, since you have several individuals or students from several cultures? Can you comment on that also, please?
I think, this is a really good question, and it's a question that sort of cuts across all of the work that we do as UNESCO. Anytime we come up with a new guideline or standard or anything, we always get the question, like how is this applicable to X country or this culture? So I think that, as I mentioned, when we did the desk research for this particular study and we explored some of the philosophical notions of happiness, we were quite careful to look at both Western as well as Eastern schools of thought. Confucius and the Buddha, for example, along with Aristotle and John Locke and others in the positive psychology. And we found that there are, a number of commonalities, particularly this idea of happiness as being defined in terms of relationships with others. And so I think Mark also mentioned in his talk that social connection is something that cuts across all of these different initiatives that have been made to measure happiness or well-being, like the Happy Planet Index or something else. So if there's anything that's common, I would say it's probably that dimension of the relationship. I think also, as I mentioned, for our particular framework and these criteria, it was informed by a survey where we had over 650 respondents from 30 countries who were answering the survey in different languages. So, does that represent all of the population of the Asia Pacific? No, but I think we do have a number of different countries and cultures that contributed to this. and that felt that this was, these were what makes school happy or unhappy for them. So that was sort of our way of addressing that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ramia. Now I go to Professor Mark, and the question will actually two questions. It's should and can well-being should well-being be taught in schools, or can it be taught in schools, and if so, how? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it can be taught in schools. I think it's really about mindsets. I think it's about perspective, and I think, there's certain kinds of pedagogical approaches, I think, that can be utilized to help young people think more about well-being, not only their own well-being, but others' well-being. So it becomes part of thinking more about their society and, the ways different kinds of people are being treated in society, for example, the kinds of opportunities certain people have or may not have. In Singapore, at least in the humanities curriculum and in the social studies curriculum, there's opportunities for this to be addressed and taught. They have an inquiry model that allows students to really investigate different kinds of social issues. But I think it's both getting students to think more about themselves and what's most meaningful to them as young people. It's asking them about their learning and the kinds of experiences they're having. It's being more really, I think, just more in tune with where they're at and some of the things that are going on in their own particular lives. So I think both it can be taught, and I think it should be. I think it should be directly. I think most of the social sciences actually are dealing with issues of well-being in some form or another. In the humanities, it's central to the humanities as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. And then there's a follow-up question on this. Then if we look into the near future, maybe a foresight, there will be jobs that will be yet to be created, and jobs that are currently in existence may no longer be in existence. So do you think that teaching well-being and inculcating the idea of well-being in our schools contribute to the development of 21st century skills person or people that are ready for any future jobs possible? So can you comment on that, please?
Right. I think well-being is. This has been a shift in my own thinking, and I think well-being is central to 21st century skills. Some of the work that's being done around 21st century skills development really looks at three different components. There's a behavioral component, which means that you're able to stay on task, persevere, you're persistent, you seek certain kinds of problems to address, you embrace challenge, some of those kinds of things. There's also a cognitive component, and we tend to focus too much perhaps on the cognitive component, that it's mostly about skills development. It is about skills development, but there's this behavioral and there's also an affective component. It's about being emotionally invested. It's about being a caring individual who can communicate and collaborate with different kinds of people from different cultural backgrounds and different sorts of experiences. So, I think well-being has to be central to 21st century skills.
Okay, then I have a final question for both of our speakers. I'm not sure if you've conducted such a study. If you have a school that has inculcated happiness or well-being, and then a comparable school, how did that play out in their academic achievements? I think you mentioned something about TIMSS and PISA in one of your slides, but overall academic performance, do you think that a school that has a program in both well-being and happiness can perform academically better or outperform another school that does not? So both of you, I think I give a chance for both of us, and then I will let the audience pose a question later on.
Well, I think that certainly in terms of a lot of the conceptual work that sort of informs a lot of this, there's this idea that positive education is kind of what they call a double helix, meaning that there's a synergy really between enhancing well-being and then enhancing achievement and learning. How that actually plays out, of course, I think it varies really depending on the school and the context. I can only say anecdotally that, for example, I mentioned there were 7 schools that participated in this seminar that we organized last year. These were all schools that had notable practices and an explicit emphasis on promoting well-being and happiness. All of these schools, when you look at the academic indicators, were performing much better than other schools in their particular jurisdiction. For example, there's one that I can cite. It's called Chulalongkorn Demonstration School in Thailand, in Bangkok, where I live, which is actually, it's a public school, but it's particularly for the children of employees of Chulalongkorn University, partially for them, but also others who have to compete to enter. But anyway, it's a public school, it's a demonstration school. And they've sort of explicitly kind of looked at their performance on, I believe, both TIMSS and PISA, because Thailand participates in both of those, comparing to other, what they call demonstration schools and other public schools in Bangkok. And they're doing much, much better, actually, even much better than the OECD average, and Thailand does quite badly, to be honest, on PISA and TIMSS. So I can't say, of course, that it's because they're explicitly, emphasizing on well-being that they're doing better, but they are doing a lot of things that sort of, intuitively you would think, contribute to that. But yeah, I think it's a challenging question, but we probably need many more studies, a lot more research that explores this linkage. I think Mark mentioned some of that in his presentation, but I think we need more.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to respond by just asking a question. When are you most productive in terms of your work? I know for me, it's when my own, I think it's when I'm most engaged, when I have something that is an engaging problem or issue. A lot of times it's something that I'm working on with colleagues. So there's a social element. It's very collaborative. It's something that I find I'm most productive when I'm working on something that is very meaningful, not only to me, but I feel like it has the opportunity to make some sort of contribution, either to the work of my colleagues or to schools. So I think if you reflect on when you're at your best, when you're most productive, I think you would see that there's a relationship between those are moments that have a lot in common with, I think, what you've heard this afternoon. High engagement, highly meaningful. Typically, it's social. It contributes in some way. It's an opportunity for you to make a difference in some way. So I think there is a very close relationship. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to let the audience نطرح المجال الآن للحضور. إذا عندهم أي استفسار for the audience, if they have any questions to pose for our exceptional speakers today, and we really enjoyed their thoughts. They're sharing their thoughts with us. So if any questions from the audience, تفضل يا أختي. Any mic? Is there any mic here? No? Maybe you can raise your voice. تفضل.
For Ms. Ramya, thank you very much for your study and keywords. You have frameworks, you have the word happiness. So throughout your study, I tried to find the word well-being in your study. So I didn't find it only once, maybe. So what's the difference between happiness and well-being? And for Prof. Mark, thank you very much. It's a completion between Mark and Ramya, two alongside each other papers. Thank you very much. And again, what's the difference between well-being and quality in education. So we have the word quality in education, we have the word well-being, and we have the word happiness.
Thank you.
Thanks.
شكرا. Can you comment?
Sure. Well, so for the first question, which I think was addressed to me, thank you very much for that. No, I think, yeah, that's a tough question, but I think probably, as I think Mark was saying in his presentation, well-being is probably a more appropriate term, like, I mean, Martin Seligman says, because it denotes something that is sort of continuous and it's not about specific incidents. I'll admit that we chose the title of Happy Schools from a pure marketing perspective because it's quite an interesting concept. I think it grabs people's attention, and whenever we talk about happy schools, people are always kind of interested to know what is this work that UNESCO is doing. So we favored happiness and happy as a term, simply to kind of get the attention of the people that we want to hear about this. But I think it's very much more in a perspective of well-being. So that's maybe a linkage that we should make more clear.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think the relationship between well-being and quality education, I think there's a very close relationship. And I think if you think about some of the indicators of well-being, I would argue that those same indicators are what constitute quality schools. They're schools where there's positive relationships. It's relationships, as Ramya mentioned, between the administrators and the community or the parents. It's relationships between teachers and students, and there's quality relationships between students in terms of the kind of work that they're doing. I think that they really map onto each other very, very nicely. I think that quality education means that there's high levels of engagement in classrooms. The focus is on student learning and student engagement. It's a very responsive sort of education where the quality relationships are really what the focus is. I think throughout. I think that's come through in terms of Ramya's work too. That it's really about these quality relationships and having positive relationships where students can express themselves, give voice to their concerns, and teachers are responding in ways that are caring and supportive. To me, that defines a quality education, and I think it leads to higher achievement. Right, so I think the idea of quality education is that it's an education that holds well-being at its center. That's what constitutes a quality education. So it's also about, students developing competencies and certain kinds of skills that enable them to be able to operate in the world and to be able to have productive careers and lives, to be good citizens. I think there's a lot of overlap between some of these ideas that we have about good citizenship education, quality education, well-being.
Okay, thank you very much. Which is
نعطي مجال لغير لو سمحتي. في حد anybody else from the audience has another question? You can have a personal one-on-one later on. Anybody else has any other question? وين؟ ورا؟
Over on the side here.
تفضل يا اختي.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. معكم إيمان علي جفال مديرة مدرسة الجاهلي في مجلس أبو ظبي للتعليم. حقيقة أشكر القائمين على المركز الإقليمي على إتاحة هذه الفرصة الرائعة. I will ask in English for Mr. Mark, but first I'd like to thank everybody about this great opportunity to talk about very important topics. My question, I'm curious about I noticed that it's your major interest or your major research about critical thinking. And as a school leader, this is one of the big challenges for us As you know, we are shifting at UAE in general and ADIC specifically, and also MOE to encourage a high level of thinking, especially critical thinking. And really still, it's a big challenges for teachers first, not just for students. So I know it's a big issue and it's a complicated issue, but in a few words, how can I, as a school leader, enhance or guide the teachers to improve critical thinking at classrooms and out classrooms with the students? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a significant issue, and what we're doing in Singapore is, I think teachers have to experience critical thinking both in their educational experience as well as in the workplace. And so this is where the role of leaders, I think, is very important, because you can model critical thinking with them, but I think it's also creating opportunities for more dialogue, more deliberation. Sometimes it's around school policies, or it might be around problems of teaching and learning. So there's a real, I think there has to be a real sort of inquiry ethos in the school that invites teachers to share their ideas, to share their views. They have to feel comfortable doing that, I think, to some extent. But I also think it's important to have models of critical thinking that you can share with teachers so they understand exactly what it means to think in ways that are maybe more analytical or more interpretive. They need to see what that looks like, what that sounds like. It's really about making thinking visible, that it doesn't just happen in the head, but it's something that's a kind of more of a social practice. The one thing that Singapore does, I think, is that's quite, it's assessed. Critical thinking is assessed on the exams. And so teachers are expected to be able to teach critical thinking, and it requires that they also be good critical thinkers as well. And so there's a lot of resources for teachers that are provided. Sometimes these are procedures for critical thinking. So for example, evaluating the reliability of information is something that we all struggle with as adults. How do we know when the information that we're getting is credible and reliable information? We're not very good at it in the United States. We just elected someone that I think there's some issues of credibility and reliability in terms of some of the things that were said during the election. But I do think Singapore has very strong models of critical thinking that they can point to help teachers understand what the nature of that thinking is. So I would say, yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think it's providing strong models for teachers so that they understand what it is, but it's also providing opportunities to practice critical thinking. And a lot of times that's in deliberation and dialogue, in staff meetings or in professional development.
Thank you very much.
There's one more final question, and then we'll end this session.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أنا منى الكواري من دولة قطر، مديرة مشروع مشابه. Sorry, I'm talking Arabic.
Okay.
عندنا مشروع خلق بيئة تعلم جاذبة. أنا أشكر طبعا المركز الإقليمي على يعني دعوتنا ووزارة التعليم عندكم. أنا كنت يعني أتمنى يكون في تطرق للتحديات اللي تواجه طبعا مدراء المدارس، المعلمين والطلبة، وحتى نستطيع أن نغير يعني قناعاتهم في أن طبعا يكون عندهم شعور بالسعادة. إلى جانب أنا حابة أشوف رأيكم في دور الوزارات التعليم، يعني مع اختلاف الأنظمة. تجربة سنغافورة أو اليونسكو دورهم، الأنظمة في الخليج تختلف، وبالتالي ما هو دور وزارات التعليم عندنا في يعني إزالة الضغوطات والتحديات مع قادة المدارس والمعلمين، وبالتالي حتى نغير هذه المفاهيم ونخلق يعني بيئة تعلم جاذبة. إلى جانب آخر سؤال، كم استغرق الزمن يعني لخلق الثقافة هذه؟ لابد من يعني هي ثقافة المؤسسية هذه والجودة مهم جدا ان ايضا يعني لابد ان احنا يعني في مشروعنا تلمسنا يمكن المهم جدا جوده اداء المؤسسي للوزاره نفسها، المشرفين، الموجهين، الداعمين للمدارس، لابد ان احنا اولا نبدا بتطويرهم وتطوير المدربين حتى نستطيع ان نطور المدارس. وشكرا لكم.
شكرا اختي، شكرا استاذ.
So thank you very much for that great question. So UNESCO indeed works at the policy level. I mean, we work mainly with ministries of education. So this framework that we published this year is essentially a tool for ministries to consider in terms of, you know, applying it. So I think the first step is really actually making a decision, you know, at the highest levels that, you know, prioritizing learner well-being is important for our country. So here in the Emirates, I mean, you've done that. You know, this is something that I think even beyond the education system, you have a national policy prioritization of happiness. So I think if other countries, say in this part of the world or elsewhere, you know, want to move in this direction, it really starts at that level, like actually saying, you know, that we want to do this and making that very explicit in terms of the vision and the mission statement. Then after that, I think it's, for example, if you wanted to use our specific framework, the ministry would have to consider, you know, what policy changes do we have to make at the highest levels in order to facilitate, for example, something like a reasonable and fair workload, which is one of the criteria, or, you know, fun and engaging teaching and learning approaches. That requires, you know, shifts perhaps in how the curriculum is organized in a particular country. So that would require reforms then to actually make that change happen. Similarly, if we're talking about different, you know, positive teacher attitudes and attributes, which was also one of the criteria of our framework, that requires new ways of thinking about teacher training and working with, you know, institutions that do teacher education to actually, you know, build in this well-being agenda into teacher education, initial and continuous teacher education. So I think it's really, you know, like if a country wants this to become a priority, it's really starting, you know, at the very basic level, like actually explicitly stating that, and then thinking about what policy changes have to be made to actually move in the direction of these particular criteria. And I think what the role maybe that UNESCO can play is that having access to some of these ongoing initiatives in different parts of the world, we can help to share and to make connections. So for example, I was talking with Dr. Rashid before the symposium started that there's a school in Australia called the Geelong Grammar School, which is very, very interested in positive psychology and positive education, and they actually set up a positive education institute in their school to train teachers on positive education. And I think a number of countries have actually reached out to them and said, you know, well, we're interested in doing something like that. Could you help us? So, you know, we're discussing with them right now in terms of, you know, perhaps making that kind of service available to other countries and helping to facilitate that. So yeah, I think there, you know, it's many different things that have to be done.
Yeah, I agree with what Ramia said, and I think to build on that, one of the things that the Ministry of Education in Singapore does is, I think they're very expert. The curriculum planning and development division is quite good at having their ear on the ground to really identify, and we are too, I think, the National Institute of Education, to really identify the challenges that teachers and students have in classrooms with change, whatever the change might be. And then they work very closely, the ministry works very closely with us at the National Institute of Education to make sure that the design of our professional development is addressing those challenges. And sometimes, again, it's providing models for teachers. And so we work pretty closely with teachers who we think are exhibiting not necessarily best practice, but are innovating and coming up with new approaches. And we work with them to make sure that that gets sort of shared and disseminated with other teachers. But I do think that, you know, it's clearly identifying the challenges and then really targeting them in terms of the professional development. And it requires really, I think in Singapore, it's a fairly centralized system, which has certain disadvantages and it has advantages as well. The advantage is that everybody's sort of working together, to really address the kinds of problems and challenges that are being faced in classrooms when something new is being implemented. So I would say that, I think the ministry can play a key role in terms of sort of coordinating some of that work and making sure that teachers and classrooms and schools are getting the support and the help that they need.
One more question. Any other question? This will be the last one? Okay. This is the last question. آخر سؤال ها.
السؤال الأخير. طبعا كل الدراسات تقدم وتقول عن الأسوياء والطلبة وكذا والسعادة للطلبة الأسوياء. الحمد لله في دولة
about the teachers. In our country, we have special needs students. So we need to mix those students with regular schools, and those special needs students have adapted in Singapore. What's happened about the special needs schools?
Yeah, we tend not to work with the special needs teachers in terms of humanities and social studies education. We have a separate academic group at the National Institute of Education that's working with special needs schools as well as special needs teachers. And part of that is there's more effort to make sure there's inclusion in classrooms. And Singapore, like the Emirates, is a well-resourced society, so it's providing the necessary resources to make sure that students with special needs are having their needs met. And there's a major initiative underway right now in Singapore to really train teachers that can address special needs students in regular classrooms as well as in separate schools. So, and I think there's also there's a lot more work that needs to be done with classroom teachers, so that they understand the needs of different students. So it's I think in general there's been a shift in Singapore from a more teacher-centered approach to one that's really more responsive to students and where their students are at. They have a much more international population in their classrooms in terms of students. And so it's really looking at what are ways to better meet the needs of the diverse student population that they have in classrooms. So I think that's one challenge that the ministry is working very hard on right now to address.
Okay, and I thank our guests, Ramya and Professor Mark, for their valuable input and contribution to today's sessions. And I think I hereby also thank Ms. Mahar Al-Mtayri, who is the director of this place, who made this possible, and also His Excellency, our Minister, Hussein Al-Hammadi, and everybody else who came. So towards the end, we just want to say a big thank you to everybody who organized this, and for our distinguished speakers and for everyone else. شكرا جزيلا اللي كان في عندكم شيء إضافي. على جهودكم المتميزة.
I would like to call Mahar Al-Mtayri and Hussein Al-Hammadi to honor the guests, please.
فليتفضلوا مشكورين.